recording is okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, actually, I know that you came here and you had a lecture on the U.S.-China trade war relations.
Yeah.
Yes, I hope I could get there, but when I noticed it's already finished, so maybe I need to ask questions about because I was working on this. I was working on this China-U.S. relations, and also I just finished the story on Russia, on the Putin's new term, because I was quite interested in this issue when I was in college. I read your book because I'm writing the thesis on the collapse of Soviet Union. Yes, that's the first time I know your name and your book. Okay, so
let me just mention that I'd like to finish by 10:30.
10:30. Okay, no problem. So, maybe we start with because you came here for this Marxist 200 anniversaries, and also
keep going. I think I'm going to close the window because it's starting to get hot outside.
Yeah, but today I think it's kind of cool. Right?
Think so? Okay. Usually it works.
Okay. Okay.
I'm sorry.
So
the air conditioning does not work very well.
Really? Okay. You could complain to the desk. Yes. So this year I think it's quite. Can I say the world is quite interesting because it's Marx's 200th anniversary and it's the 5th anniversary of 1968, and it's also Trump just last night he just announced the meeting with Kim Jong Un in Singapore, and also the Chinese-U.S. trade relations. The U.S. delegation just left. So I want to ask you, if maybe in the future when we look at 2018, will we say that this year is quite a remarkable year, or just a series of coincidences? Is that a turning point here?
It's too soon to say.
Okay. But after this kind of signs, will you say that you could say some, very important changes, maybe?
Well, I think there have been important changes since Trump was elected president in 2016.
Yes.
It's a very rapid-fire succession of new developments that are potentially dangerous, most of them.
Yeah.
And with the constant appearance of new developments, it's difficult to see the big picture.
Yeah, so you need still to observe. Yeah.
So I can, and it's very difficult to understand why these years come along where important things happen that are related in many different places. So we'll see. 1968 was such a year.
Yes. In just 50 years, it's quite.
And we did not know that in 1968.
Yeah.
Later, you could look back and see.
So talking about Trump, that because everyone said that he's with a lot of uncertainties, but now do you think he still has uncertainties because actually he's doing everything he promised, right? Do you think now actually Trump is much more predictable actually?
I don't think he's doing some of the things he promised, but not all. In my view, Trump was able to win the U.S. presidency by projecting a certain politics and ideology, and that is authoritarian right-wing nationalism.
Yes.
And there is a wave of this all around the world at this time. In France, with the Le Pen party, in several states in Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, in Austria, in Turkey, in India, in the Philippines, and Putin in Russia is an earlier example of this. It's a particular politics, and in my view, it comes from outside the ruling elites. It's not a reflection of the ruling elites. Trump is the first person to be elected president of the USA in centuries who was not supported by any part of big business. He was opposed by big business. So this is a very unusual development. However, when he took office, he was able to win election by projecting a pretty consistent politics that included the vilification of immigrants, of minority groups, various minority groups, of other countries, Mexico, China, with hints of violence against those he views as adversaries. I assume I don't have to give you the examples of this. Perhaps you know the threat to imprison Hillary Clinton, to repress the news media, etc. And a kind of a statism, a call for using the state to build infrastructure, to be aggressive toward other countries. He did not follow neoliberal politics. He opposed free trade, which is a core tenet of neoliberalism. And he said he would protect the main social programs in the U.S. because historically this kind of politics typically is somewhat welfaristic.
Yeah, but he also cutting taxes.
Okay, well that was not part of his original appeal. In order to get elected, he mentioned, deregulation. He didn't emphasize tax cuts at all in his campaign.
Yeah.
Then he took office, and there was a change. So you said consistency. So the politics changed when he became president, because Congress, the Republicans in Congress, are overwhelmingly neoliberals. They're not right-wing nationalists, and they have the power to throw him out.
So you think that tax cuts is kind of a negotiation between these two sides?
Yeah, I think he turned over domestic economic and social policy to the neoliberals. He appointed all these hardcore neoliberals to regulatory agencies, to Office of Management and Budget. Came up with a budget plan. His first budget plan was huge cuts in social programs, contrary to what he had said when he was running for office.
Okay.
So it's now I view this administration as a kind of a mixture of right-wing nationalism in international policy, in international economic policy and immigration policy, but neoliberalism in domestic economic and social policy, which was not really part of Trump's original politics. So that gave rise to the tax cuts for big corporations and wealthy individuals. And the infrastructure spending program, which was a major part of his campaign, is gone. It turned into a privatization proposal of public assets, which will not go anywhere. It's not. It won't produce any spending, so there's no longer any political or economic coherence to it.
So what about his team? Because you're talking about his shift, and we also see a very shifting his people. Like Steve Bannon is gone, and Tillerson is gone, and now it's Pompeo, it's Navarro. So, do these people reflect his negotiation with this neoliberals? Or
well, it shifted in. He was being blocked by the neoliberals. In Congress, in his cabinet. Cohen is a neoliberal. Tillerson's politics were not clear, but Tillerson was not a right-wing nationalist. And so getting rid of them, he brought people who agree with his right-wing nationalism into the high positions. So this represents a strengthening of the aggressive posture toward China, toward Mexico, but he's facing a problem in that U.S. big business is not supporting this. The tariff threats against China that's opposed by U.S. big business and by the traditional political elite in the U.S.
So you think that the big business opposing this trade war? But I talk with some, the companies and enterprises here. Although they think,
what did they say? I bet I know, but I want to hear it from you.
Yeah, they don't like the tariff already, but they think Trump is doing something right to oppress China.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this is a key point. I've been making this point in my lectures that Trump's anti-China actions represent a particular politics, which is the view that the U.S. can gain only by pushing down other countries. That every country can gain only by taking advantage of others, and he wants to take advantage of others.
Yeah.
But the aim of stopping China's rise, or at least slowing it, is shared much more broadly with U.S. big business and the U.S. political elite. And so the question arises, why? Why do they take this view of China?
Yeah.
And I believe it comes from the long-standing dynamics of capitalism and imperialism. There's a long history.
Yes.
The global system was created by the powerful capitalist states and has evolved through various forms over the years. And in most periods, there has been one capitalist state that has been, do you know the term hegemon?
Yeah.
The global hegemon.
Yeah.
Okay, and it was Britain in the 19th century until World War I. Then in the interwar period, there was no hegemon, and there were 2 world wars.
Yes.
And then after World War II, the U.S. emerged as the global hegemon. And as is typical, the global hegemon designs the form of the global trading and investment system and enforces it. And the dominant capitalist power, while in some periods there's a certain amount of cooperation among the leading capitalist powers, there's always a drive to control, to dominate.
Yes.
And this comes from the capitalist drive to not just to sell goods, but to control markets, to make sure that foreign investment can be made and safeguarded, to control sources of raw materials. So the rise of China from a nice place for U.S. business to do low-wage production, to sell things, China is changing. China is now on a trajectory to become a developed country that will become the equal of the U.S. in technology, and this is always perceived as a threat to this kind of thinking, because the belief is the U.S. dominates. If the U.S. does not dominate, someone else will, and then the U.S. will be subordinate. So that's, I believe, why there is this drive to keep China from rising further. China is a big country with a long history and a lot of strengths of its culture. And I think while there are problems with China's political system, it has certain strengths in economic development.
Yes.
So I think so. I think that's a long answer.
Yeah. No. It's very, very interesting. So from your perspective, because you say that's ideological and it's about hegemony, so who rules the world, who dominates the world. So do you think that the tensions between these two countries are maybe unnegotiable, inevitable, because maybe they can reach some agreements, to reduce the trade deficit, but it cannot solve the problem that China is developing, and China will one day.
But it's not inevitable that there will be serious conflict. It's inevitable there will be tensions. But how that works out, there are various possibilities.
Yeah.
And fortunately, Trump's tactics have alienated not only U.S. big business, but Britain, France, Germany.
Yeah.
And so this weakens the ability of the U.S. to push China down. I don't think the U.S. has the power to do that on its own. Although I think the European powers share the same concerns about China's rise.
So
let me get some water. So hopefully, China will make some offers. Will reduce tariffs on U.S. automotive vehicles. They're saying they're going to open up their financial system.
Yes.
I think that's a big mistake. But
really?
Why? They don't do that. And then Trump will say, "Okay, I have a victory."
Yeah. So why do you think it's wrong to do the financial reform? Because now I think it's now what China is now advancing with the new Yigang.
I think both economic theory and history show that liberalization of the financial sector is a big mistake. Finance is not just one more sector like automobiles or steel. It is the underpinning of the economy. And when the financial sector is liberalized, so that financial institutions operate based on doing what is most profitable, it never works well, because financial institutions can always make higher profits by antisocial activities, by speculative activities. They can make profits by providing financing for productive activity, but they're much lower than speculative activity. And we saw this. I mean, was anyone watching for the, after 1980, when in the U.S. the banks were deregulated, they were made free to do what they wanted, and they increasingly engaged in speculative activity that led to the big financial crisis. All the big U.S. banks would have disappeared if they'd not been saved by the government.
But China now itself, it also has its own, problems with finance, about the debt, about the banks, the shadow banks issues.
Well, the shadow banks are a problem, but I don't believe the debt in China is a big problem, actually, because the state backs up the banks, and state-backed banks don't become bankrupt.
Okay.
They can simply not, they'll have non-performing loans. So what? Nothing happens.
Yeah, I mean, someone will buy for it, right?
But if they have private investors, they're saying, okay, we'll have private investments in our banks. Tell me, what benefit will this bring? Can you think of any benefit from having J.P. Morgan Chase buying shares in ICBC?
It's maybe just J.P. Morgan earn more money.
Well, J.P. Morgan will make profits. What benefit is there for China?
I think there's.
I can't think of one, but maybe you know one. Okay, I'm ready.
I think that's complex, but just maybe some people think that if the state own the banks and make efficiency low because they don't have competition and cause some administrative costs because you have such a bureaucracy to control these assets. Well, that's what Chinese are concerned about.
That's right. Yeah. Those are the arguments. I don't believe they're valid. I think state-owned enterprises can be just as efficient as privately owned enterprises. J.P. Morgan Chase is owned by many, many shareholders. Yeah. The managers are not directly controlled by the shareholders. ICBC is owned by the state, but the top managers, the state is not right there looking at them. It's the same problem. If the state insists that the top managers of ICBC operate efficiently, it's the same as the J.P. Morgan Chase CEO deciding to operate efficiently to make profits. There's no magic about the pursuit of profits that somehow compels magically efficient behavior. We know that some private companies are very inefficient. They pay much too high salaries to their CEOs and their managers. So this belief that if there's private investment in state-owned enterprises, they will be more innovative and more efficient, I think it's a myth. I just co-authored a paper that I presented at the Marxism Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And my Chinese co-author was responsible for doing data analysis of technological innovation of Chinese enterprises. And by every measure, state-owned enterprises have been more technologically progressive than domestic privately owned enterprises in China. They do more R&D, they introduce more new products, they get more patents. There's a state agency that gives awards for major innovations in China each year, and the state-owned enterprises get almost all of the awards given to enterprises. The private ones get almost none.
Yeah, but there's a phrase in China that called the state maybe grows, but the people didn't get benefits, and the people even go back. That there's a phrase called China. So do you think there's a problem?
I know, it's a part of neoliberal ideology.
Yeah.
It's first belief. If state advances, private retreats, the public loses. This is neoliberal ideology. It's
yeah, but in China, maybe people really feel about that. That's country that can get money, and China has become stronger, but people, they may not get that of benefits.
So ordinary people have not been benefiting much in China.
They're benefiting, but they're thinking that maybe the burden, the economic burden grows too fast, and they're not, just as happy or like people, in America or something else. Chinese people are hardworking, but they didn't
Where there's a free market, right? The free market, private ownership.
Yeah.
Well, do you know when America grew the fastest?
When?
What period?
I think maybe after the
World War II.
Yeah.
From the late 1940s to the early 1970s.
Yes.
That was the period of fastest growth in the USA, in all the developed capitalist countries. What was the form of capitalism in that period? It was heavily state regulated. The banks were all heavily controlled by the state in that period. That's when growth was fastest. That's when the income of ordinary people rose the fastest. In the neoliberal era, after 1980, the banks were deregulated, the public enterprises were privatized, growth has been slower, wages have trended downward.
Yeah.
Chinese people's perception of America is not always exactly accurate.
Yes. And what about now? The rate of profit is now going down or up or...
At the moment?
Yeah.
The rate of profit actually reached its highest point in the U.S. in the mid-1960s, in the heyday of regulated capitalism.
Yeah.
In the neoliberal era, the rate of profit recovered from the 1970s, but it never reached as high as in the regulated capitalist era in the 60s, but the capitalists got much richer.
Okay.
And they love it.
So what about now?
Recently,
yes.
The rate of profit has been falling in the U.S. From 2014 to 2016, it fell somewhat, although it's still relatively high. And in 2017, it rose very slightly. But investment has been very little. There's been very little investment. Usually, when the profit rate is high, investment is high. But this relationship has not worked in recent years. That's another whole subject.
So
productivity growth has almost stopped in the U.S. It's been very slow.
Yeah, but what Trump is doing now won't recover this trend, right?
No.
So, is America on the eve, of recovering, or maybe facing, another crisis?
Neither. American economy and the West European economies are in a state of stagnation.
Okay, another stagnation.
It's not crazy. It's not decline, but it's very slow growth. Typically, from a business cycle recession, the period until the next business cycle peak is usually relatively vigorous. For the period since the end of World War II, the GDP growth rate from the bottom to the top of a business cycle is in the neighborhood of 3.5% to 6% per year, which is fast for the developed countries. The current period from the summer of 2009 to the most recent period, the GDP growth rate in the U.S. has been 2.2%. It's very slow. Because it's so long, the unemployment rate has gotten relatively low, because even very slow growth, eventually lowers the unemployment rate. Although the low unemployment rate it does not tell the whole story of the state of the labor market. At a 3.9% unemployment rate, wages should be going like this, but they're not. Wages are barely rising. So this indicates a lot of hidden unemployment. You know, the labor force participation rate is very low by historical standards. There are many people who are not looking for jobs for various reasons. And also, workers are very weak. They have very little bargaining power because of the way neoliberal capitalism functions.
But you have more confidence in China's economy?
Yeah, China's economy is still doing relatively well. I mean, the slower growth rate was intentional. The state planners decided to reduce the growth rate, which had been about 10%. It was too fast.
Yes.
So they went down to 6 to 7%, and are focusing on dealing with environmental pollution, overcapacity in various industries.
But you also say that something wrong, some problem with the political system, and now they're actually entering another phase of reform in China. But we know that have some challenges. So what do you think that this reform is going now, and what kind of challenges is some people maybe from above they don't want to reform, or their interests might be maybe affected?
Well, I'm not sure what direction the reform will take in China. The top leadership says they will follow Marxism, although it's not clear where that will lead. In China. I mean, I think there are certain contradictions in China's growth model. I view it as a mixed model that includes, on the one hand, predominantly market economy, but a significant element of state planning, industrial policy, state-directed financing of potentially important industries, a lot of state regulation of the development of the economy. So it's not a free market model. It's at the same time, while there's a significant capitalist sector of privately owned enterprises, there's an important state-owned sector. It's more like the regulated capitalism of the post-war decades than the form of capitalism in the neoliberal era, although it's not exactly capitalism in my view, because there's this, ruling communist party. The capitalist class which exists in China does not hold state power and does not really dominate the economy. So it's a mixed system with socialist and capitalist features, in my view.
But you don't think there's a problem, because this might go away and the market reform will, in turn will coerce the political regime to do some changes, and they will see there's a contradiction. You have not a free political system, but you have a market economy that is advancing. Would that be one day will be a contradiction very serious?
Well, it's normal to have some mixture of modes of production in an economy. I mean, the U.S. is not just capitalism; it also has some other social forms. The states do a significant amount of production, federal, state, and local governments, and there's a non-profit sector. There are some worker-controlled enterprises, some cooperative enterprises. My backpack was produced by a cooperative enterprise, very successful. But the capitalist sector is dominant, totally dominant in the U.S. China has a mixture. That does not necessarily mean bad performance. Mixtures can work very well. I think the main contradictions are the high degree of inequality in China, which is as great as the U.S., which is a result of the introduction of the market and private ownership, creates a demand problem. to grow at 6 or 7%, demand has to grow for Chinese products at 6 or 7%. And China has probably the lowest share of household